Iran came to the table. They offered to give up their nuclear weapons. They were ready to sign, ready to surrender. And yet, American troops are now being prepared to march into Iran. But why? What really happened behind those closed doors? Because what you've been told is not the whole story. The real reason America is moving toward war is something far darker, far more dangerous than anyone is willing to admit. Welcome back, dear friends. You're watching Currency Archives. Now listen, if you haven't subscribed yet, think of it like this. You're above 50 years old. You have seen the world change. Wars come and go. Economies rise and fall. And you know, the most important thing in life is to never miss the news that matters. So hit that subscribe button right now, because on this channel, we cover the stories the world needs to understand. And before we begin today, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? In the spring of 2025, something extraordinary happened in the world of international diplomacy, something that received far less attention than it deserved. Iran came to the negotiating table, not with demands, not with threats, but with an offer. Iranian officials under President Masoud Pezeshkian quietly signaled to the international community that Tehran was prepared to show flexibility, real flexibility, in its nuclear program. For a country that had spent decades defending its right to nuclear development, this was not a small gesture. This was a significant shift in position, one that analysts who studied the region closely immediately recognized as meaningful. The proposal that emerged from Tehran was carefully structured. Iranian officials indicated they were willing to limit certain nuclear activities, activities that the West had long argued posed the greatest risk of weapons development. They spoke of potentially surrendering enriched uranium stockpiles, the very material that sits at the heart of global nuclear concern. They discussed the possibility of tighter restrictions on centrifuges, the machines that enrich uranium to the levels required for both civilian energy and, at higher concentrations, weapons-grade material. But Tehran did not stop there. According to analysts who reviewed the framework, Iran also indicated openness to expanded international inspections, a demand that Western powers had pushed for years. This was perhaps the most striking element of the offer. Allowing international inspectors broader and deeper access to Iranian facilities would have represented a fundamental shift in how Iran managed its nuclear transparency. It would have meant opening doors that had remained tightly shut for over 2 decades. In exchange, Iran asked for one thing above all else: relief from international sanctions. To understand why this mattered, one must understand what those sanctions had done to the Iranian economy. For years, Iran had been effectively cut off from the global financial system. Its oil exports, the backbone of its economy, had been severely restricted. Its businesses could not access international markets. Ordinary Iranians had watched their currency collapse, inflation rise, and their purchasing power disappear. The sanctions were not simply a political inconvenience. They were an economic stranglehold that had been tightening for years. So when Tehran proposed a framework that went beyond what many had expected, potentially even exceeding the terms of the original 2015 nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA, it was not simply a diplomatic gesture. It was the action of a government under severe economic pressure, searching for a way out. Some analysts noted privately that the proposal, if taken seriously, could have represented one of the most significant diplomatic breakthroughs in the Middle East in recent memory. The JCPOA itself had been considered a landmark agreement when it was signed, bringing Iran into a framework of international oversight in exchange for sanctions relief. What Tehran was now offering appeared, in several key areas, to go even further. And yet, Washington's response was not a counteroffer. It was not a request for further negotiations. It was not even a formal rejection delivered through diplomatic channels. Instead, the world watched as the United States moved steadily, and then rapidly, toward military action. This is the detail that serious analysts and business observers found most significant. Not the conflict itself, but the sequence of events that led to it. A nation under economic pressure had extended what appeared to be a genuine olive branch. The international community had barely had time to process the offer before the situation on the ground shifted entirely. For entrepreneurs and business decision-makers watching from a distance, this sequence carried a warning that went far beyond geopolitics. It demonstrated something that history has shown repeatedly, that in moments of high tension, economic logic does not always drive political decisions. And when political decisions override economic logic at the level of nation-states, the consequences rarely stay contained within borders. Markets feel it, supply chains feel it, energy prices feel it, and eventually, businesses everywhere feel it. The offer Iran placed on the table in early 2025 was not simply a diplomatic document. It was a signal, one that, had it been heard differently, might have changed the entire trajectory of what followed, but it was not heard differently. And what Washington did next would change everything. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over the world's financial markets when powerful governments stop talking and start acting. That silence arrived in the summer of 2025, and it arrived without warning. While diplomats were still quietly discussing the implications of Iran's nuclear offer, while analysts were still debating whether Washington would engage seriously with Tehran's proposed framework, the situation on the ground shifted in a way that stunned even the most seasoned observers of Middle Eastern affairs. The United States moved toward military action, not gradually, not reluctantly, but with a speed and decisiveness that left little room for the international community to respond. Former President Donald Trump stepped forward to defend the strikes publicly. His argument was straightforward. The strikes were necessary, he said, to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. It was a justification that had been used before in American foreign policy. It carried weight with certain audiences. It provided a clear, simple narrative for a situation that was anything but simple, something that did not add up. Only months earlier, during the brief and extraordinarily intense conflict that had come to be known as the 12-Day War, Trump himself had stood before the world and made a declaration. Iran's nuclear capabilities, he announced, had been completely obliterated. Those were his words, completely obliterated. The language was absolute. It left no room for ambiguity. And yet here was the same administration, now justifying fresh military action against Iran on the grounds that its nuclear program still posed a threat. For anyone watching with a business mind, trained to notice contradictions in official statements, trained to read between the lines of government communication, this inconsistency was not a minor detail. It was a red flag of the highest order. When official narratives contradict themselves within a matter of months, it means one of two things. Either the original claim was not accurate, or the real reasons driving the decision are not the ones being stated publicly. Neither possibility was comforting. But there was something else happening, something even more consequential, that was taking place entirely behind closed doors. Israel. Reports began to surface, carefully sourced and corroborated across multiple intelligence and diplomatic channels, that Israeli leadership had been quietly preparing for unilateral strikes on Iranian targets. This was not speculation. This was not rumor. These were credible reports suggesting that Israel had grown impatient, that it had concluded, through its own strategic calculations, that Iran's nuclear infrastructure needed to be addressed decisively and immediately, with or without American coordination. American personnel were positioned throughout the Middle East. Military bases, advisory teams, intelligence operatives, thousands of American lives were embedded across a region that was rapidly becoming a tinderbox. If Israel struck Iran independently, the consequences were predictable to anyone with knowledge of regional dynamics. Iran would retaliate, and its retaliation would not be limited to Israeli targets. American assets would be at risk. Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed this concern, carefully, diplomatically, but unmistakably, during remarks delivered on Capitol Hill. His message, read between the lines, was clear. The United States had not acted simply out of aggression or ambition. It had acted, at least in part, because the alternative, allowing Israel to strike first and triggering an uncontrolled Iranian response, was considered more dangerous than controlling the situation directly. Acting first, in Washington's calculation, was a way of managing chaos before it became unmanageable. But here is what that calculation revealed to the global business community, and what every serious entrepreneur and economic decision-maker should have recognized in that moment. The Middle East had crossed a threshold. This was no longer a regional dispute managed through sanctions and diplomatic pressure. This was an active military confrontation involving the world's largest economy, one of its most powerful regional militaries, and a nation sitting directly on top of some of the world's most critical energy corridors. The rules of engagement had changed. And when the rules of engagement change at that level, energy markets do not simply fluctuate. They fracture. The strikes had been justified. The contradictions had been noted. The Israeli role had been quietly acknowledged. But none of that prepared the world for what was now being seriously discussed inside Washington's most powerful rooms: ground troops. And the moment that idea moved from whisper to policy, everything changed. There's a number that every serious student of modern warfare knows by heart: $2 trillion. That is the conservative estimate of what the United States spent in Iraq alone. A conflict that began with confident declarations of swift victory and ended, years later, with a withdrawal that satisfied nobody and resolved nothing. Afghanistan added another $2 trillion. Combined, $4 trillion. Thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. And at the end of it all, say, two nations that remained fundamentally unstable, their economies shattered, their futures uncertain. Now, in the summer of 2025, Washington was beginning to have a conversation that carried unmistakable echoes of those earlier decisions. The conversation about sending American ground troops into Iran. For anyone who had studied the economic history of American military interventions, truly studied it beyond the headlines and the political theater, the moment this conversation became public was not simply alarming. It was a moment of profound historical recognition, because the pattern was familiar, and the pattern, without exception, had always led to the same destination: prolonged conflict, massive expenditure, economic strain at home, and a global ripple effect that touched every market, every supply chain, and every business operating anywhere near the affected region. Iran was not Iraq. This point cannot be stated strongly enough, and it is the point that Washington's most cautious voices were making in the background, even as the more aggressive voices dominated the public conversation. Iran is a nation of nearly 90 million people. It possesses one of the most mountainous and strategically complex terrains on Earth. Its military, despite the damage inflicted during the 12-day war, retained significant capacity for asymmetric warfare. Its population, regardless of its feelings toward its own government, had demonstrated historically that it would resist foreign military presence on its soil with extraordinary determination. The word that military strategists use for this kind of conflict is attrition. Not a swift campaign, not a decisive engagement followed by a controlled withdrawal, but a long, grinding, resource-consuming confrontation that drains not just military capacity, but economic capacity, national morale, political capital, and critically, investor confidence. And then there was the language coming out of Washington that deserved very careful attention: unconditional surrender. These two words, deployed by officials describing what they expected from Iran, represented something far more significant than a negotiating position. In the history of modern geopolitics, unconditional surrender has been demanded of defeated powers in the aftermath of total war. It was the language of World War II. It was the language used when one party had already been comprehensively defeated and had no remaining leverage. Using that language now, while the conflict was still active, while Iranian military capacity remained partially intact, while regional proxies aligned with Tehran were still operational across multiple countries, was not a statement of strength. It was a statement of intent. An intent of that magnitude carries an economic price tag that markets immediately began to calculate. Oil prices surged, not modestly, but sharply, in the kind of sudden vertical movement that triggers automatic alerts across trading floors from London to Singapore. Energy analysts, who had been cautiously optimistic about stabilization, revised their forecasts overnight. The word they kept returning to was uncertainty. And in the language of global finance, uncertainty is not simply an abstract concern. It is a direct cost, measured in risk premiums, in delayed investment decisions, in capital that moves away from exposed markets and toward perceived safe havens. For entrepreneurs operating in industries connected, even indirectly, to energy, logistics, or international trade, the implications were immediate and concrete. Shipping routes through the Persian Gulf through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes, were now operating under active threat assessment. Insurance premiums for vessels operating in the region climbed. Delivery timelines became unpredictable. Supply chains that had been carefully constructed over years began to show stress fractures. And all of this, every single economic consequence described above, was happening before a single American boot had touched Iranian soil. The conversation about ground troops was still just a conversation. But markets do not wait for conversations to become decisions. They price in the possibility. And the possibility alone was already costing the global economy in ways that most people, focused on the military and political dimensions of the crisis, had not yet fully registered. History had seen this before. Every major Middle Eastern military escalation of the past 50 years had followed a recognizable economic arc. Initial shock, sharp energy price increases, market volatility, a brief period of adaptation, and then, if the conflict prolonged, a slow, grinding erosion of global economic confidence that lasted far longer than the conflict itself. The question serious decision-makers were now asking was not whether this pattern would repeat. It was how severe this particular iteration would be. And the answer to that question depended entirely on one thing: what Washington decided to do next. Because if ground troops moved from conversation to command, the economic calculation would change completely. And the world would enter territory that no financial model, however sophisticated, was fully prepared to navigate. There's a moment in every major geopolitical crisis when the conflict stops being a news story and becomes a balance sheet problem. That moment arrived in the summer of 2025, quietly, without announcement, without a press conference or a presidential address. It arrived in the form of numbers on trading screens, numbers in quarterly forecasts, numbers in the private conversations of finance ministers and central bank governors who were watching the situation in the Middle East with growing alarm. The world was already fragile before the first strike. This is the context that most mainstream coverage consistently failed to provide, and it is the context that makes the economic consequences of the Iran crisis not simply serious, but potentially historic in their reach. Global debt levels had been climbing for years. Interest rates in major economies had remained elevated, squeezing businesses and consumers simultaneously. Supply chains, disrupted first by the pandemic, then by the conflict in Ukraine, then by a series of regional tensions across multiple continents, had never fully recovered their pre-2020 efficiency. The global economy, in the language of structural analysts, was operating with very little cushion. And into that fragile environment, the Iran crisis arrived like a stone dropped into still water. The first and most immediate effect was oil. Within days of the escalation becoming public, crude oil prices surged to levels that analysts had not projected for another 18 months. The Persian Gulf, through which, as previously noted, approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply travels, became a zone of active strategic risk. Tanker operators began rerouting vessels. Insurance underwriters began repricing coverage for Gulf transit. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow critical passage through which so much of the world's energy supply flows, became the most watched choke point on Earth. For businesses, the mathematics were straightforward and brutal. Higher oil prices mean higher transportation costs. Higher transportation costs mean higher prices for every physical product that moves across any distance, from the food on supermarket shelves to the components inside electronic devices to the raw materials that feed manufacturing operations across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Everything that moves burns fuel, and fuel had just become significantly more expensive. But oil was only the most visible symptom. Beneath the surface, something more structural was beginning to shift. Financial markets, which had been navigating elevated volatility for months, responded to the Iran escalation with a particular kind of instability that veteran investors find most difficult to manage. Not a clean crash, which at least provides clarity and allows for decisive repositioning, but a grinding, unpredictable oscillation, sharp drops followed by partial recoveries, followed by fresh drops, triggered by each new development in the conflict. This pattern is historically associated with one specific investor behavior: capital flight. Money began moving, away from emerging markets perceived as vulnerable to energy price shocks, away from currencies of nations with significant Middle Eastern trade exposure, away from sectors, aviation, logistics, manufacturing, retail, that carried direct sensitivity to energy costs and supply chain disruption, and toward the traditional destinations of frightened capital, the US dollar, gold, and government bonds of nations perceived as stable. For young entrepreneurs and business decision makers in developing economies, this capital movement was not an abstract financial phenomenon. It was a direct threat to the funding environment they depended upon. Venture investment slows when institutional capital retreats to safety. Credit becomes more expensive when risk premiums rise. Expansion plans get shelved, hiring freezes, growth trajectories flatten. The conflict was in the Middle East, but its economic consequences were landing in offices and boardrooms and startup ecosystems thousands of miles away. And then there was the question that the most serious economic minds were beginning to ask. The question that went beyond oil prices and market volatility and capital flows: who profits from this? Because in every major conflict of the modern era, the economic damage has never been distributed equally. While the majority of businesses, consumers, and economies absorb losses, a smaller, more strategically positioned group of actors accumulates advantage. Defense contractors, certain energy producers operating outside the conflict zone, commodity traders with the sophistication to position ahead of price movements, nations with alternative energy export capacity, suddenly facing dramatically increased global demand. History does not simply record who loses in wars. It records who is positioned to gain. And in the summer of 2025, as the Iran crisis deepened and the global economy absorbed shock after shock, the most important question for any serious business mind was not how to survive what was happening. It was how to read what was coming. Because the decisions being made in Washington about ground troops, about unconditional surrender, about how far the United States was willing to go, were not simply military decisions. They were economic decisions. Decisions that would determine energy prices for years, that would reshape trade routes and regional alliances, that would accelerate certain technological transitions, particularly toward alternative energy, while devastating others, that would create winners and losers across every sector of the global economy in ways that were already becoming visible to those paying close enough attention. The Iran crisis was not a distant geopolitical event. It was a stress test of global supply chains, of energy market resilience, of financial system stability, of the ability of businesses, large and small, established and emerging, to navigate an environment where the rules could change overnight because a conversation in Washington moved from whisper to policy. And the result of that stress test would not be known for months, perhaps years. But one thing was already certain. The businesses and decision makers who had been paying attention, who had been reading the signals, studying the patterns, and positioning themselves with knowledge rather than reacting with panic, They were already several steps ahead. The only question that truly mattered now, was whether you were one of them